Hello and welcome to our podcast. We're a group of UC Berkeley students taking Seeing People, a class that focuses on teaching students what homelessness is, its roots, the multi-level systems and services that exist to address it, and the levers at each level to effect change.
This course also works to address homelessness and houseism in our community. Houseism is the belief that people experiencing homelessness are intrinsically less worthy or human. Houseism at the personal and structural levels rationalize homelessness in our society and maintain its growth and entrenchment in our community and our country.
In this course, we were split into groups to each address a stigma against people experiencing homelessness, which we will refer to as PEH as we continue on this podcast. The goal of our group's project is to address the stigma that all PEH take part in substance abuse and to examine how this impacts these individuals in the Berkeley area.
Our audience are UC Berkeley undergraduate students as we hope to change their opinions and negative views of PEH. In order to begin to tackle this stigma, we wanted to see what UC Berkeley students thought about the correlation between homelessness and substance abuse. As UC Berkeley students ourselves, we assumed that most other students we asked would have nuanced answers, but we got a wide range of responses.
Our first question was, if you had to estimate, what percentage of PEH do you think abuse drugs?
I'm going to say like 30%, perhaps more.
I would say 50.
65.
I would say 50%.
Yeah, maybe 60.
35.
65.
Maybe like 20%.
Like 20%?
I'm going to say 20%.
Yeah, it's maybe 10, 15.
Okay. 50%?
I'd say 60.
The correct answer is that only around 30% of people experiencing homelessness engage in substance abuse. Moreover, in comparison to the general population, about 12% of Americans use illicit substances and almost 20% have at any point used illicit substances. While homeless populations do engage in substance abuse, the stigma around it would generally lead people to believe that this gap is much larger than it is in real life.
Our second question was, what do you think leads to homelessness?
Well, I think addiction to drugs could be a huge factor, but of course, some people do just fall into unfortunate circumstance.
Yeah, I think it's definitely multiple factors. Addiction to drugs would probably be a big one. If you're relying on a caregiver and they stop providing that, that might be another big one.
Societal factors and the way that our capitalist system is set up.
Yeah, structural inequality.
Probably drug abuse.
Poor education system and lack of resources.
It could be cost of living, but in some cases, it could be drug abuse or mental illness.
No community, nobody to help you, losing a job.
There are 5 main factors that lead to homelessness. The first is a lack of affordable housing, because when housing costs are high and wages are low, many individuals and families struggle to find and maintain stable housing. The second factor is poverty, since people with limited financial resources may not be able to afford rent, utilities, or other basic necessities, leading to housing instability. The third factor is unemployment and underemployment, which can make it difficult for individuals and families to cover their housing expenses. The fourth is systemic factors such as systemic racism, discrimination, and inequalities in the criminal justice and child welfare systems. These can disproportionately impact certain populations and contribute to homelessness. And finally, lack of support services such as limited access to social services, mental health care, addiction treatment, and other supportive resources can make it challenging for individuals to escape homelessness.
Our third question was, do you think substance abuse leads to homelessness, or do you think substance abuse is a byproduct of homelessness?
I think it leads to homelessness, most likely. That would be my opinion, yeah.
I would say it plays a role in leading to it, but it might increase with homelessness.
I think it could be either and or both, but regardless, it's a mental health issue that needs to be addressed regardless of if it led to the homelessness or if it developed afterwards.
Yeah, I think it could be both. It depends on the situation.
I think it's a
I think it leads to it, and then sometimes it's a byproduct, but most of the time it leads to it.
I would say definitely both, but maybe more of a byproduct.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably both.
I think it's a byproduct.
The vast majority of people experiencing homelessness begin to have drug abuse issues after becoming homeless, not before. Homelessness itself can be a stressful and traumatic experience that leads some individuals to turn to drugs or alcohol as a coping mechanism. The harsh realities of living on the streets, including exposure to danger and violence, can exacerbate mental health issues and lead to substance abuse as a way to self-medicate.
Our fourth question was, do you think PEH who use substances deserve as much help as PEH who do not?
No, I don't. I think that if you're receiving a form of welfare from the government, I think you need to prove that you're actually trying to move up in society and provide for yourself. You can't just be collecting a check forever and making bad decisions and just expecting other people in society to pay for your existence.
I think as far as being provided for, one of the best things you could do to someone who's addicted to drugs to provide for them would be to force them to quit. So if we were to look at government assistance for that, I think they're very deserving of help for that before anything else.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't cure addiction. It's hard to do it, and they need just as much help as everybody else.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We really hoped everyone would say yes, but as you heard, we did get a response of someone saying no.
Based on the students we talked to, there's a wide range of perceptions that UC Berkeley students hold in regards to the stigma. By writing and recording this podcast, our group hopes to correct these misperceptions. We hope you enjoy the rest of our project.
Hi, my name is Azit Jung. I'm here today with Sean, and we are here today to interview Ari Neulight.
The goal of our project is to address the stigma of all people experiencing homelessness or using substances, and to examine how these preconceived notions impact people experiencing homelessness in the Berkeley area specifically. Ultimately, we plan on releasing a podcast and distributing it to UC Berkeley students with the goal of debunking this myth.
First question is introducing yourself a little, what does your work on campus here look like?
I'm the homeless outreach coordinator is my kind of role. Position started in July 2017, and it has kind of four main components. The first part is doing kind of direct service outreach, referral, linkage, some case management, really what's needed for folks that are community members that are primarily unhoused in and around the Telegraph, People's Park, Willard, and kind of central campus area. So that includes everything from, providing kind of warm items or needed items for basic needs to helping with, some vital records, getting kind of birth certificates, social security cards, IDs, to, linking to benefits, helping with housing, working, connecting with kind of community providers or healthcare, mental health services, housing, etc. The second part of my role is really working with students as kind of more of a teaching support role. So that could include working with different student groups, working with student interns, providing kind of trainings to student groups or student organizations, doing classes, lectures, panels, all across campus. And thirdly, I work with the university itself to kind of work on its own policies and procedures as it relates to working with our unhoused neighbors, and kind of projects that might emerge from that work. And then I would say lastly, it's really being a liaison with community partners, whether that's churches, neighborhood groups, nonprofits, city, county, in working together in addressing homelessness locally. And sometimes that also includes working on research or evaluations or projects.
Yeah, it sounds like you're doing a lot of great work around the Berkeley area, and we definitely appreciate that. As a follow-up, we're kind of wondering at the administrative level, how does the conversation typically go around the people experiencing homelessness? What kind of assumptions do people typically make about People's Park residents?
Maybe the assumptions, which I think aren't too far off, is that most folks are there because they're struggling, and they're kind of looking for a place to be. And in many ways, folks kind of come together in common spaces, and Often it's a space that's near students, it's central. Those are some of the things that for some folks are important when they're looking for a place to be and survive. I would say, I think that folks who are there are vulnerable. And often, the vulnerability includes kind of being, the subject of kind of crime. So kind of being victims primarily. And that's kind of a part of the experience and the challenge, maybe, those are kind of the main conversations that we tend to have, but, which I think kind of ties closely into some of the kind of the solutions that they've been kind of participating in. A positive conversation around how to kind of work together with I think this role has really helped kind of bring us on the ground in ways that I think there have been kind of a separation for a while of folks kind of not necessarily on the ground kind of understanding needs. But I think, instead it's really about working together to find solutions for folks, which has been really positive, to be honest. And hopefully, that's very different than I think in the larger culture, the assumptions that are often had, and probably even among the student population, which I think might look different.
Right. Like I think a lot of students tend to have preconceived notions that they take into how they interact with these populations. So I guess another question I want to ask is in your direct outreach with people at People's Park, again, there's assumption that a lot of these people are very heavy drug users. How do you feel that perception differs from the reality of people who live there and their relationship with drugs?
I think one of the biggest things I think, that I often hear just broadly is I think people often think, say, well, why are people, homeless or houseless, or, depends on really how we, talk about one's experience in lots of ways. And, I think there's an often, I hear at least broadly, people say, oh, it's because people are drug addicts or, using substances. And that's really what's, the problem, and closely tied to that, perhaps mental health issues. And so I would say the reality for me, at least from my kind of work, is that, people it's a complicated mix that often isn't what leads one to becoming homeless in the first place. And I think that's a broader system challenge that we're working with. And, it is common, for folks to be using, and it's really a way more than anything to kind of work with the trauma of the whole situation, and perhaps some situations that came along the way, and to kind of ways in general for folks to stay safe. And so, that's my experience. I mean, sure, most folks I come across and work with use. That's kind of common. But I guess it's easy to say, well, that's the problem, as opposed to actually that's how people kind of survive, right? And so, the focus for me has really not been on, substance use as the problem. It's really been in, how do we support folks to shift into a kind of stable environment and provide support, around them, regardless of their situation, and then build from there. And we find that in general, when folks do shift into this kind of situations, and in this case, kind of generally housing, not always, but that tends to be one of the most stable situations, and kind of provide support around that kind of other things kind of emerge in people's lives that kind of often shift their relationship to substances. And most folks, as I'm working with them, the goal, it's really been how do we work towards what's important to them? And often I find is as we're taking those steps, perhaps one's relationship to substances might be getting in the way, and that becomes something, but, without kind of often stepping out of kind of the survival crisis mode, it's really hard to make a lot of those changes. And so, I think it kind of goes to the model I'm pretty sure you've heard around housing first, and I think it's really important, to again kind of shift these conversations, and the narrative is really, I hope kind of shifts to, around folks just surviving, and thinking, knowing that we can kind of do better, and we should be doing better.
Right. You don't mind asking follow-up questions. It's housing first initiatives. It's in that once people are within a position where they're not constantly thinking about survival mode, they're able to better build themselves back up. It's really hard to build yourself up when you don't even have that baseline foundation. So like,
Yeah.
I guess like, do you have like any specifics on like what percentage of people are able to like get off like substances once their like needs are met?
I, at least for someone who kind of works deeply around harm reduction, I tend to not think of things in terms of like who's stopping using and who's not using. I try and think of instead like, it's generally been, how do we shift folks out of survival to create opportunities for something different? And then hope that through that relationship that there's then an opportunity, which often happens, to kind of shift folks' relationships to use. So, whether that's to kind of increase safety or decrease harm, right? And so I generally find for most folks, that's what happens. I do think that I can kind of give a little caveat to that in a second, but I don't tend to measure things, at least in terms of the work I do. And I think in terms of the thinking through in this field of like you're using outside, you come inside, then you don't need to use, or it's not using, I think it's it often those shifts it, right? So that it looks different. It's perhaps not as chaotic. It's not as often, and people have a different relationship to it in their lives. And that's kind of a pretty common outcome. I think one of the challenges though, and I do hear this is, a lot of our housing, not a lot, some of the housing that we have tends to, permanent housing often has like vouchers and things tied to them, where folks then end up getting units in the private market. And I think one of the challenges we have in those situations is there's both the, the meaning community piece and there's the housing piece. And so I do think like often we have to tie those things together. And, as we're thinking of kind of supporting the stability, it's also really important to kind of be supporting folks and kind of building community and finding meaning. And I think if we don't do each of those pieces and do them well, then I think we're not really building the conditions for folks to be successful as they transition inside. So I guess that's a kind of a caveat in my mind. And like, I think one of the best, antidotes to some of the things that kind of lead folks to, continue to be engaged in a kind of a spiral of use that's really harmful and not working for them.
And so we spoke to some students, and they have some mixed opinions on the reasons why people experiencing homelessness may be using substances, or that they choose to be in that situation purposely. I'm wondering, where do you think these attitudes or beliefs come from, if you had to guess?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I could say, I just think we live in a society that has like a larger narrative often of like that if, you're not doing perhaps what's expected, then like you failed in some way, like it's a personal failure, or there's a sense that like, if you fall, like you should be pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, the kind of that expression. And that if you can or you don't, then like that's your problem. Like I think some of those are like some of the values and kind of moral judgments that are often baked into our world. So I guess like to me, that's one, obviously people might have their own personal experiences of people or family members or, folks that, maybe have impacted those judgments, or maybe things they've seen in the media or in the news that have had like an impact on some of those ways of thinking. I think in general, often one of the biggest things that impact our views is really, not knowing each other, I'm assuming that's kind of part of your idea of this podcast. I know there was actually a smaller podcast project that was done at one point around People's Park, called the People's Park Podcast or something. And I think, similarly, it was an idea of, how do we start having, our neighbors be like humans that we like walk this earth with and understand kind of our sameness, and our humanness and our, as a way to understand, just our common humanity even more. And so, I guess that's kind of part of it too.
If you don't mind me, like, I guess, like doubling back. So you mentioned with harm reduction, there's like a need for like these communal systems to, I guess, like effectively engage one in like harm reduction and to get these like positive shifts in people's relationships with substance abuse. So like, what do these like community like, systems look like, and how do we build them?
That's a really good question. So like, I know like for me, and I think that's one of the bigger challenges in our society is this sense of kind of like folks just kind of lose, like it's hard to find connection and community. And it's such an important part of like a healing process, right? And so I think there's just this famous kind of neuroscience or drug research studier, I think out of New York, who, often said like, that the opposite of like addiction is like connection, right? That like it has this kind of whole book around that like really it's this kind of aloneness, disconnection that is really what's tied to, and from kind of his work and his point together, addiction, and it's really kind of connection and community as an alternative. So I mean that's a great question. I know like me personally, for example, like I've worked in the most of the 15 years before coming to this position, I worked in San Francisco in kind of a model of what's called like permanent supportive housing that is kind of congregate, I would say. So it's kind of a model where we have these kind of housing sites that kind of have a similar population or often have like multiple populations. And, kind of similar to maybe the Hope Center, which is a kind of a building in Berkeley that's kind of relatively newer, where, folks would come in, it's affordable housing, targeting folks with experiences with kind of houselessness. And then you had services on site and you were able to fund the level of services. And the services weren't just targeting case management, but really were about building community. It was about celebrating together. It was about, having like games and movies and, events and outings and, having tenant councils with kind of tenant voice being kind of centered. So it's really about like having like both the community piece that you're building and growing together with also kind of the housing piece and the support. And then people kind of picked and choose what it made sense for them. And I love that model in that it really understood. It has its challenges. I mean, but I love how it really acknowledged those pieces that were so essential for people. And so, I'm seeing, that's not always available, but it's like, how do you build that in community centers? How do you find spaces where, people who, love the things you do, whether it's the dog walkers, because you all just love kind of being around dogs, or if it's the community garden that you all work together on, like, how do you find those spaces where community gets built and we, stay connected to? And I think that's often such an important part of the transition and healing, that I think has a large role in really shifting, a range of kind of the harms that, folks are involved with into to have them play less of a role and have less of a voice in their life.
Besides informing and educating students on the facts pertaining to substance use among people experiencing homelessness, what else can Berkeley students do to help fight these myths or directly help people experiencing homelessness who are being affected by the myths?
I always kind of think you just included many ands as you possibly can, right? So I'm like, oh, how do you build in, resident halls? I'm assuming there's like spaces for, trainings or conversations. Like, how do you build this? How do you build that in there? How do you build it into, Cal Day or, Golden Bear orientation? Or, how do you do a campaign that somehow, gets kind of, shifted through? How do you promote kind of conversations among groups of folks? Or I would say, like, how many different spaces that are touched with like multiple messaging can kind of be put out? I mean, I think we had the same thing around homelessness, and it was really about how do I partner with different community groups, and then community groups would work on projects, and then they would present in some of these kind of larger forums, and then we do train the trainers, but it's hard to sustain stuff a lot of times at the university with all the kind of continual changeover, that it almost has to be part of like the larger culture for it to be kind of integrated. And I think that's a larger like journey that includes the things that we're talking about, which is these campaigns that we put together that really kind of share different stories, ways and movies and media that kind of, humanizes and brings stories forward, kind of broader spaces that impact, I think are going to have a larger push than per se, doing things within the university. But, wherever there's spaces for students to be engaged, I think is great.
Thank you so much again. Thank you for your time, and it was great.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
The following is the stigma we hope to address in this podcast, an important reminder as we wrap up. While populations of people experiencing homelessness are affected by substance abuse, there is a stigma that views all homeless people as drug users. Additionally, people view homeless individuals who are affected by drug addictions as, in a sense, deserving it because of their drug addictions. Moreover, as this is a subject that intersects with a lot of different academic interests, we wanted to explore a broad academic perspective on the issue. As a group, we want to address this stigma through the lens of various academic disciplines to complement what we learned from interviewing Ari Neulight and Berkeley students on Sproul.
We will briefly explore the war on drugs, stigma through the lens of peace and conflict, and the criminalization of behaviors associated with homelessness.
Not talk about the stigma around homelessness and drug use without detailing its ideological formations in the historic context of the war on drugs. I want to make the case that the ethos that guides the war on drugs and its shortcomings is the same ethos that is currently informing our rhetoric around homelessness. While there is a relationship that links homelessness and drug use, the extent is greatly exaggerated within the public consciousness. And if we decide that the modern homelessness must be addressed in the same way we addressed the drug use in the Nixon and Reagan administration, we will be making the same disastrous decisions. Nixon ran for office on a platform that emphasized law and order, resulting in policies that would crack down on crime. This meant an expansion of the government's ability to pursue criminal drug use. The Nixon presidency would see the first use of the term war on drugs to articulate the goals of these policies. Reagan would later greatly expand on the drug war. A racialization of drug use would frame racial minorities as bringing drugs into the white domestic sphere. Foreign invaders were getting your kids addicted to crack cocaine, and policy followed suit. Disproportionate penalization of crack cocaine, more common within impoverished Black communities, due to its cheap production, contributed towards a heavy association between criminality and Blackness. Policies like mandatory minimums placed minimum sentencing requirements on drug offenders, greatly increasing incarceration numbers. Emphasis on criminalization also saw repealing of harm reduction policies, so that had a major impact on exacerbating the HIV pandemic. What I want to point out is that the drug war, with its emphasis on existing privileged populations, with its emphasis on protecting the white affluent domestic sphere, had massive implications for marginalized groups seen as outside of that. Moreover, the guiding ideology that underpins these different policies is intensely individualistic. Our answer to the vast complexity of substance abuse during this era was quite literally just say no. The framing glosses over any understanding of why people engage in substance abuse on any greater systemic level. Continuing with the administration of Bush Sr., was ramping up the narrative threat posed by drug use. Rhetoric was a key component of the drug war during the Bush administration, and it took an explicitly moral angle. In comparison to previous administrations, where the moral attitudes were much more implicit in the arguments made, drug use was framed as a moral issue, not a health issue. The drug addiction was principally a failing of personal responsibility that had to be addressed with the full force of the law through hard-on-crime policies. I do not want to come across as discounting personal agency, but undeniably, our rhetoric of drug use has historically been framed in individualistic terms, and I would argue it does so to the detriment of any broader systemic understanding of drug use. And subsequently, the drug war was a failure. The result of the war on drugs was a modern prison industrial complex as we know it, a system that leaves in its wake broken lives of nonviolent drug offenders and families that were ripped apart in the process. It saw a ballooning of the prison population, a system which cost the government billions each year, an astronomical prison population matched by no other country on the planet. The bootstrapping mentality as applied to drug use and the policies that followed were a failure. Moreover, an effect of American individualism is a victim blaming of these circumstances. The ethos that justifies this is a belief that the individual is at a moral failing. That is, a person's poor character and force of will. That means that they are homeless, criminal, addict, etc. And all these labels feed into each other. If you are an addict, you aren't strong enough to overcome addiction. If you are a criminal, you are morally a bad person. If you are homeless, you simply don't work hard enough. So this intensely individualistic prescription of social ills ends up intersecting at the crossroads between criminalization of homelessness, the criminalization of drug use, and the people who experience both in tandem. Our response to these issues takes the same shape because fundamentally, the same ideology and same framework informs how we respond to both of these issues. As homelessness has become increasingly a problem within American cities, the same ethos that informed the war on drugs is now being used to inform our reaction to homelessness today. Popular conservative pundits talk about homelessness in the same terms we used to talk about the war on drugs half a century ago. Homelessness has become a partisan issue, and the Republican approach has, instead of any truly well-researched policy, primarily been defined in negative terms against progressive policies that aim to help the homeless. The Republican framing is that Democrat homeless and drug policies in metropolitan areas are ineffective and are itself the cause of rising homelessness. Moreover, that the cause of homelessness is drug use and mental illness. Substance abuse and mental illness precede and cause homelessness, according to how Republicans define the issue. According to Ben Shapiro, homelessness in major cities is largely driven by mental illness, severe mental illness, and drug abuse and alcohol abuse. These arguments are wrong. Homelessness typically gives rise to substance abuse as a coping mechanism and tends to exacerbate mental health conditions. However, this is not entirely indefensible. There's a complex argument to be made that we cannot address homelessness without also addressing both of these issues that I would agree with. But underlying these assumptions is a disgust with homeless people dealing with mental illness, people dealing with substance abuse, which erases any productive conversation. More than any conversation about mental illness and about substance abuse, conversation and the implicit understanding is about disgust and undesirables. Take any conservative pundit, and you will find an underlying disgust with the unhoused. Greg Gutfeld would say, people are just doing it because they can live above and beyond civil society. You don't want to live by our rules, but then you don't get to live with us. Tucker Carlson would go as late in describing homeless people as the least productive, most antisocial parasites in our society. Matt Walsh would say Singapore is able to have nice things because they execute drug dealers by hanging and arrest even petty vandals and thieves and beat them with a cane until they bleed. And when criticized, would double down and compare the unhoused to zombies who need to be put down. The list goes on. Disgust is an essential and underlying component of the current discourse on homelessness. The point of these arguments is not to actually engage with how we can better improve the lives of homeless people. The point is to be able to ignore systemic cause, to individualize the cause of homelessness, that individuals are drug addicts, that individuals are mentally ill, and that by moving the issue of homelessness away from systemic cause, that individuals can be castigated while the broader status quo system remains intact. If homelessness is caused by drug abuse, then it falls back to drug abuse and not housing policy. And if drug abuse is obviously caused by weak character and lack of willpower, and so really the cause of homelessness is just people being unwilling to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. So the ghost of Ronald Reagan will haunt us until the end of this democracy.
Throughout our time in the class, we learned about the social determinants of health, which according to the CDC are, quote, the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. They are the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of daily life, end quote. As a pre-law student, I'm mostly interested in uncovering what policies and laws have influenced the stigma around homelessness and drug use. According to researchers Angela Maria Pinzon Rondon, Amir Ataran, Juan Carlos Botero, and Angela Maria Ruiz Sternberg, the rule of law itself is a social determinant of health because a country's adherence to the rule of law was found to impact certain conditions like maternal mortality, cardiovascular disease, and more. What does this mean? Our policies and black-letter law on the books and our societal adherence to these laws directly determine our ability to live happy and healthy daily lives. As Johann Hari details in his book, Chasing the Scream, the so-called war on drugs was and is an intricate set of laws that arose out of a decades-long movement for criminalization of substances that the American public had previously been able to buy with relatively little regulation or restriction. Beginning with the Harrison Act, which was signed into law on December 17, 1914, and taxed the sale and distribution of, quote, opium products and coca leaves, end quote, aka heroin and cocaine, and leading up to the present-day U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration's scheduling system that ranks substances based on their potential for medical use as well as potential for abuse or dependency, with corresponding criminal prosecution models in place for possession or sale of these substances. The transition of the war on drugs from a byproduct of the prohibition and temperance movement to a fixture in both federal and state legislation points to a kind of codification of stigma around drug use. When there is systemic alienation and criminalization of addiction and substance use, we see that it harms society more than approaching addiction with compassion. Johann Hari, in a portion of his book that is a memoir on his loved one's experiences with addiction, says that, quote, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection, end quote. And I love that quote because I think it is truly encompasses what this class, Seeing People, is really about, and also because I believe that the work being done to end homelessness in general should focus on connection and being in community. Together, we have what it takes to end the alienation of our most vulnerable community members and create laws that promote happy and healthy lives for everyone.
After listening to Avery's breakdown on the linkages between policy affecting people experiencing homelessness and their social determinants of health, we will now transition to analyzing Ari Neulight's interview through a Peace and Conflict Studies framework, or PACS. To begin, what does peace and conflict look like in our project setting? Students' stigma as a form of symbolic violence inflicted onto our populations of people experiencing homelessness is the conflict, whereas peace is the goal towards complete harm reduction. But what does peace look like phenomenologically? Put simply, in reality. According to the founder of PAX, Johan Galtung, he defines peace in two ways, in negative and positive terms. Peace can be viewed as simply the lack of conflict, which is, in our context, the complete eradication of stigma, or in positive terms, cooperation and integration between human societies, which is what Ari Neulight recommends in the shadow of the failed negative peace approach, the war on drugs policies. As you heard, Ari shares his own experience interacting with people experiencing homelessness as an outreach coordinator. Just listening to him dispel the stigmas voiced by Berkeley students is an active form of positive peace. Humanizing homelessness and thus reintegrating those experiencing it into our imagined communities is beneficial. Yes, indeed, popular cultural narratives that substance abuse and homelessness are a product of individual failure and deviant moral character contributes to our society's apathy and resentment of the issue, hence intensifying the symbolic conflict on our streets, the arteries of our communities. But Ari goes further, describing to us what positive peace looks like on the ground and what it could be inside UC Berkeley. Going back to our PAX theory, a prerequisite to positive peace is grassroots involvement as necessary power brokers funneling necessary resources from the powers that be, i.e. government, donors, and foundations. Ari introduces the permanent supportive housing policy in San Francisco and in Berkeley at the Turner Center as prime examples that do just that. In addition to providing housing, Bay Area programs, such as those mentioned, offer community services on site. Ari acknowledges that this is paramount for substance abuse reduction. As Avery cited, the opposite of addiction is connection. Centers have spaces and times allocated for games, movies, and celebratory events. People also have a voice. Tenants make up councils that operate as a source of cooperation and integration with the broader local community. But how do we make positive peace touch us? How can we, students, according to Neulight, be loci of positive peace too? Well, it starts here. Opening a conversation to achieving negative peace by eradicating stigma is the first step. But what's next? Finding supporting spaces of communion and connection. Those can be places around Berkeley that invite rather than exclude, whether that be a community garden like what began in People's Park several years ago, or the chess club, taking back urban corners and making them into wholesome spaces. But is this enough? One key challenge Ari identifies is sustainability. Once one cohort leaves and another one enters, how do we make sure progress isn't lost? That's where culture needs to change, by not only destroying stigma, but replacing it with positive, healing approaches to trauma of homelessness that will have direct impact on the use of substances. That means bringing training to Cal Days, orientation, and residence halls. Improving culture is what we need. That's what positive peace in our community means. Substituting addiction from disconnection with addiction and rehabilitation.
We hope that the information presented here illuminates the changes that need to take place in the Berkeley community and compels you to share your talents in addressing stigma related to homelessness and drug addiction. Additionally, we want to thank Ari Neulight for taking the time to meet with our team, Dr. Colette Arswald for her tireless work both in the lab and the classroom, and her GSIs Charlie and Rebecca for all their support of this project. If you would like to further support work being done in the community to end homelessness and drug addiction, please consider donating or volunteering your time to the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, the Suitcase Clinic, or Larkin Street Youth Services. There are many organizations based in the San Francisco Bay Area dedicated to ending homelessness. The ones mentioned are some that we were introduced to throughout our time in Seeing People. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen.